Hello, everybody. This is the Kubernetes SIG architecture meeting for May 21st, 2020. And we have a full house here. I want to remind everybody to abide by our code of conduct and treat each other with respect. We'll get started now. So I'm displaying my, hang on. Children. In any case, why don't we get started? There are a couple things on the agenda. I did want to say something. I know a number of you are probably for the second item here. Unfortunately, there was nothing on the mailing list about this. And so I personally have not had a chance to gather state about it. I'm talking about the KubeUp ownership. So I think that we would be better off if for that particular item, we send it out to the mailing list, make sure that everybody who's interested has an opportunity to know it's going to be on the agenda for next time, and we defer it to that. So that's generally our policy, is that these sort of things, like the first item on the agenda here was raised a few days ago on the mailing list, gives everybody an opportunity to gather up their thoughts about it, and for people who are particularly interested in it to actually show up at the meeting. We did have attendance today. In any case, so sorry if that's a disappointment, but if my co-chairs agree, I think that should be deferred to the next meeting.
That sounds good to me.
Okay, thank you. Then let's get started then on the first item on the agenda here, boundaries of platform extension mechanisms. David and Mo and Jordan, which one of you wants to get started?
I can give an overview of this. So the thing that prompted this was a proposal to add APIs to Kube API server to allow controlling the authentication configuration for the API server. And so that was linked in the mailing list thread. There's an open KEP PR around that, and that started the SIG-Auth leads trying to think about how do we extend the platform? What are the different dimensions of extensibility, and what is sort of the reasoning behind the different types of extensions we provide and support, and where we expose those, how we expose those. And so the goal here is to kind of share some of that thinking, hopefully so it helps other SIGs, other components that are also trying to think about and reason about their extension mechanisms. This represents at least a few hours of untangling our thoughts. So hopefully these dimensions are helpful to share and think about, but then also to kind of ask questions about how people are thinking about cluster configuration APIs versus APIs served by the Kube API server. So that's one question. And then the second one, and this was brought up in the mailing list discussion, how does sort of a path to being included in conformance affect our thinking about whether things should be built into the Kube API server as built-in APIs. If we don't think we would require something to be in conformance and require every Kube API server that's conformant to surface this capability, is that the bar for a built-in API now? Something that Brendan said in the mailing list thread sort of sounded like that, and I know we've sort of danced around that at points. We're in a weird place where we have things like RBAC that are not part of conformance, but are sort of older built-in APIs. It would be good to be clearer if the expectation that something would be added to conformance is basically the bar for building a new API into the Kube API server. So those are the three things that I was kind of wanting to cover here. Just if people had thoughts about these dimensions of extensibility, other ways of thinking about it, additional things they think we missed, that would be helpful to maybe add to this body of knowledge. And then those two questions, like do we distinguish between cluster configuration APIs and Kube API server APIs, and the conformance question.
So a question here, Jordan. So what do we expect to come out of this discussion? Are we trying to write down what we expect? So next time when another KEP comes with a question similar to what was pointed out, then it's easy to answer thumbs up, thumbs down?
Yeah, decision trees that kind of help us think about things like this, so that if a proposal comes up and we've already thought through, like, is this more of a cluster configuration API? If so, then maybe it belongs in cluster API or something similar, and not in a built-in Kube API server API. A decision tree like that is helpful. Similarly, a decision tree like, based on feedback, this would not be acceptable in some percentage, some significant percentage of environments. It doesn't look like this would be reasonable to include in conformance. Therefore, we don't think it should be a built-in API. So decision trees like that are helpful. And we're kind of, both of those things, the boundaries of what should be in the API server and the conformance aspects, are things that touch SIG architecture.
One other comment maybe Jordan I would have is
before we jump into discussion, is someone taking notes? Notes would be helpful for this, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yes, no.
I'll try and take notes if somebody drops a handy link into the chat.
The one comment I was going to have, Jordan, if it's okay, was I agree we haven't been consistent on this, and the decision tree is really helpful. We also have some APIs that we haven't fully promoted that went down various paths that I want to use this as an opportunity to maybe reflect on. So dynamic kubelet configuration is a situation where I feel like we started down a path that we haven't really fully finished. And I think I can't identify a user who has enabled it. And I'm wondering if we should reflect on that as we evaluate new APIs like this.
I know Tim had his hand up as well.
Yeah, I agree with Tim. If we can use the raise hand, and I can moderate. Can't necessarily maintain ordering that way, but we'll do that.
Yeah, it's hard. This is a pretty large call. Just to, as it's been pointed out, it's weird for us to have a bar around conformance, because I've worked on conformance for so long, as being the gate, because it's very inconsistent with what we do today. So I think, as kind of maybe as Derek pointed out, is that we need to rationalize kind of what we have today, along with any criteria we want to put forwards towards the future, because otherwise it's way too arbitrary. If we were to say like it must meet this bar going forwards, it's clear that we've never had a bar or clearly had that clearly defined lines as prescriptive before.
Mo, I think you've got your hand up there, and then I guess I'll raise my hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, Derek, could you describe the dynamic kubelet configuration in like 2 sentences for folks that are not familiar, to give us some
so about I want to say 2 years ago, there was an effort to allow the kubelet configuration to be changed dynamically, right? So if you wanted a Kube API surface to go and say, enable this kubelet flag, you could do that. And you had a link on a node that says, this is where my kubelet config is. And then the kubelet had a complicated orchestration procedure to roll out that new config. My experience on this is that the feature, I think, did reach a beta status, but I don't think anyone is actually using it in production. And I think it's fair to say that in SIG node, I wouldn't encourage users to use this right now. One of the issues that I think comes up with kubelet configuration is making that surface configurable was insufficient when you didn't make the container runtime or operating system itself configurable. So it wasn't like you had one uniform config you could apply across all clusters and everything was going to be great when dealing with how kubelet configuration was laid down. So my personal feeling was, knowing what I know now, I would probably have cautioned us against doing kubelet config dynamically, but that I'm not sure if other components to memory have explored similar things, but my experience right now with kubelet config was, I think it was a mistake. Maybe others in the SIG feel differently, but I think that's my personal feeling.
All right, I don't see a way to raise my hand on the Zoom client, but I'll make a few comments, and then it's Tim Alclair and then Daniel Smith. So with respect to conformance, I think that's an interesting idea that Jordan raised, but I'm a little bit leaning towards what Tim is saying, that I'm not sure that that's the right bar for whether something becomes a core API or not. I think that, you know, we do have efforts going on there to manage optional functions, but the level of granularity we want to do that on is relatively high, meaning I don't want to create profiles for every little feature that's possible. So I think that requires some more thought. I think it's an interesting conversation we should have probably, but I'm not sure it's the right time now. I think the thing that specifically, if we go back to these issues that David raised of what are those dimensions of extensibility, and I think that a critical aspect here to probably have some sort of guidance for people on is around the frequency of change, things that are only ever really set at the beginning of the cluster life, or maybe, you know, changed once if somebody made a mistake, although why they would just create a cluster, it's not clear. Probably don't deserve to be in an API that can be altered at runtime, that adds substantial additional risk, both security-wise and operationally, when it's modifiable at runtime like that. So I think that is a basic principle that makes a lot of sense to me. I believe next then we had Tim Alclair.
I had a few comments on the conformance conversation, but if we're moving on from that, I don't want to rat hole on it. So I can pass.
Okay, then Daniel, then Clayton.
Yeah, I was also going to say something on the conformance. Like I find it surprising that people think it's okay to have GA things that aren't somehow conformance tested. I actually didn't realize that our RBAC stuff was not conformance tested, and I think that we should probably fix that.
We are working on that. The issue is that in the conformance program, things that are not mandatory for cluster operators, that aren't sort of always on, we don't currently have a mechanism, although we've made progress towards it. It's slow moving, but we're making progress towards having a way such that essentially we can say, if you enable this functionality, then it must behave in this way. as opposed
Yeah,
to.
I think specifically for like RBAC, I think people depend on that in their application, like being the ability to like set up roles and stuff. And it should be like in conformance. It shouldn't be an optional part of the system. Yeah, maybe that's.
Well, I would defer to
my
SIG
opinion,
auth
but-
on that, right? Because there's other authorizers you can enable.
I would just
So I
point
think-
out that not only is it not part of conformance, it's not even on by default. So like there's two different distinctions, right?
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting.
Okay. I'm sorry. I believe it was Clayton next.
Yeah, and I was just gonna like to add to Derek's point on kubelet config. I like really wanted to hammer on what we made dynamic was not the right thing, or the argument of the lesson there is what we made dynamic was not the right thing, which is when we had very narrowly scoped things we make dynamic, like compute and services and all of that. Like we designed to have a dynamic system, whereas the config for the kubelet, we didn't make such a distinction. I think that's like the salient lesson is whatever extension point exists has to have a really clear use case that has value for a set of scenarios and has to have justify its value. Just doing dynamic config of a component, I don't think is sufficient. Like we've never made the scheduler config generic, and I would certainly caution against, for instance, if the scheduler, and this is like totally hypothetical, but like if the scheduler wanted to change priorities and make that dynamic, there's lots of people who the scheduler is inadequate. We have a lot of flexibility in the code. But if we were to go do a dynamic scheduling policy that changed how scheduling behave, that really needs to be a coherent design feature. I feel like that is a minimum bar for any of the config that we do, is it has to be a reasonable knob that sufficient number of people want to change at a dynamic and high frequency rate that it justifies its existence, or it is so painful to do it otherwise that it absolutely must have a dynamic config. And there was an example of this, but like webhook, like we wanted the platform to be extensible. Not everyone is ever going to deploy a webhook, but the alternative was, as in Jordan's decision tree, putting code into Kube API server, and that was really just too painful.
I think I'm next because I've been keeping track. If
Great.
Mr. Allclair, if you can lower your hand, I think that'll help. Otherwise, so I've been around and both producer consumer for dynamic kubelet config on the cluster lifecycle side. And although the implementation was not actually exactly what we wanted, and I think there was boundary lines that were crossed, as Clayton pointed out, there is definitely demand from the wild to be able to modify certain sets of configurations. There should be like a classification, like there's static configurations, things that you shouldn't change, it can't change. Then there are things that are potentially runtime configurations where you can actually modify them either on the fly, and then there's like a partial runtime configuration which causes a process to restart. That's said, like we've never had that delineation clearly demarcated inside of how we do things. We never had dynamic configuration plumbed through the whole system. It's very ad hoc today. The promise of a grand unified field theory of component config is what we've always talked about and wished we had from the cluster lifecycle perspective, because we treat config in the same way. We never got there. It was never really funded from a community perspective. We've kind of, as Derek pointed out, it's like it's gotten to a certain point and then just kind of stopped and not been revisited. That said, there is demand. There exists precedent all over the code base. There's stuff in the component config and the proxy. There's this weird mechanism that actually exists inside the scheduler, which causes a hard restart on the config for weights and balances. So it's just inconsistent. I think the demand is there, the need is there. I think the enumeration has not been cleanly defined and the boundaries haven't been cleanly defined.
Who's next? I've lost track.
John, you're muted.
Why don't you go next, Joe? I think it
Okay.
was Mo. I don't know if Mo. I don't know after you.
The one time versus many times config, I think this is something that is, I mean, there are definitely things like, you know, extending the API server in other ways like webhooks where these things are not changing often. And I think we see that there's a chicken and egg thing where as we make things dynamic, people use them more and they find more usages for them. And I think one of the signs for me, like in this particular example, is that we see people hacking around to introduce new auth mechanisms because it's so difficult to install at the API server level. And so one example is like you look at Rancher and they have essentially a way that they're abusing service account JOTs to provide user accounts in the system because it's so difficult to actually apply this stuff in a consistent way across all the different distributions and ways that people have to manage this. And so I think in this particular case, that's an example there. And then the other point I want to make is that, you know, for a long time now, we've been taking the control plane by being a fixed idea to being something that is really sort of more fuzzily defined. Like, is a webhook part of our control plane or not part of our control plane? And we're doing this more and more and more. And so I
Yes,
think
it
anything
is.
that, what's that? Go ahead, Daniel.
Yes, webhooks are part of our control plane.
Right, but the thing is that you start, you know, between a webhook and a controller and CRDs, the delineation between what is control plane and not control plane is really becoming a fuzzy thing.
If it can break the users, then it's part of the control plane.
What's I'm sorry?
If part of your control plane can break your users, then it is part of the control plane.
What do you mean by break users?
Right, like if you're sending a request, an API request, and API server gives you back a 500, and the result is some component that's not API server, like the fault is somewhere else, like whatever caused that failure is part of the control plane. That's my mental rule.
Okay, and I would actually say from the user's point of view, core functionality is part of it. And like, you know, let's take a look at sort of the Ingress v2 gateway stuff that's going on, right? It's more likely that we're going to take stuff that's built into the control plane now and actually move that out into be a CRD type of thing that sits on the outside. So we're going to have fundamental functionality that is layered on from the outside using CRDs. And so, yeah, I mean, I think we can look at the control plane from sort of the strict, like, are we returning 500s? But then we can also look at the control plane in terms of core functionality. And we're moving more and more of that stuff to run on cluster being dynamically configured. And so I don't think that there's a clean line here. So I'll let it go and let other folks talk.
Sure. Why don't we go to Mo now?
I'm fully trying to remember all the things I wanted to say, but I think some. On the dynamic kubelet thing, I was just kind of Googling it while we talked so I could try to, like, I had vaguely known about this feature. I mean, to me, a problem that I'm kind of observing from what folks have just said is that it was done sort of wholesale, right? Like, here's a blob. And as Derek pointed out, it was incomplete because you can control the OS, right? So I would not, for example, propose like dynamic API server config in one giant blob either, right? That's why the KEP that I wrote was much more targeted at a particular thing, right? Authentication, right? And from a technical implementation, it's very straightforward, right? It's very much a decision of, do we want to do this, not how do we do this? The other bit I wanted to sort of point out is something Brendan Burns said in the thread, and I don't think he's on the call, but I did find it interesting though, is that, you know, as time goes on, if the canonical way that many folks consume Cube is through hosted providers, it becomes harder to have these distinctions of like, I only do this less often, or I only do this sometimes, because if the answer becomes I can never do this because I'm never present at that layer, well, it doesn't matter that I only want to do it once. You made my one go to 0 and I'm unhappy. Okay?
Well, I'll just make a comment, and then Steve maybe I think would be next. In a hosted provider situation, the hosting provider is taking on a lot of the management burden and the operational burden, and so for them to have I don't think that whether it's available via REST or whether it's available via files or CLI flags is really pertinent there, because the hosted provider can make all those options available if they choose to, any one of those options.
No, that's fair, right? But the problem becomes you're effectively asking everyone to reinvent the wheel over and over again, right?
And then there'll be inconsistency in terms of how you apply that, right? It'll be very specific.
Right, like the point of using the Keybase guy is I don't have to reinvent it. John, I think I'm
sure, but I think that, I mean, if we're talking about functionality that's sort of at the cluster operator level, then the ability for managing that and the responsibility for that is going to be with that cloud provider. Well, it's up to the cloud provider to kind of thread that weird line between what they give to the customers and what they don't. You know, the additional risk associated with exposure via REST API. I mean, I don't know. It's a good point, right?
Right.
Either way,
I
the
think
technical
the whole
implementation of
500
it doesn't
point,
necessarily affect how you control it. But I've taken enough time out of turn, so I'll let Steve go here.
if I can make a quick comment, like the whole 500 thing, like an admission webhook can 500 your API server a whole lot more than authentication ever could, right?
Authentication can do it every request.
No, the way I wrote this step guaranteed that you would never fall through with something that was dynamically configurable unless everything before it failed. So this thing has significantly a smaller surface area of breaking your API server.
I don't follow how that's possible, but.
All the local static config is always considered first, right? So if you do it that way, you guarantee that the only time you ask the remote config is after all the local config says, I don't know what this request is for, right? So by definition, if you're getting a 500, it's because everything local says, I don't know what's going on. And then the remote thing says, I also don't know what's going on. And no matter what, your request was going to get denied anyway.
I see. Okay.
Steve.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to add on to where I think Mo was going with this. John, a few minutes ago, you said, you mentioned about hosting providers taking on burden. And in this case, as a customer, I look at more like, what are my rights as a user? Are there certain things that maybe this gets into conformance, but if a hosting provider says they're offering Kubernetes to me, I would like there to be certain capabilities that I know are available to me as a consumer that they're not going to cut me off from. And I was delighted to see those proposals because I've been cut off from being able to integrate my own authentication system all over the place. I know exactly how it works, and yet I'm not allowed to do it, and too many times because I either opt to take on the burden of operating the cluster entirely myself, or I'm told that as a customer, I don't have that right because I can do something, I don't know, dangerous or something. So I see some of this stuff as not just the dimension of how dynamic it needs to be, but really who has the right to determine what is available to the cluster operator. And maybe, as I saw a point made very early on, maybe this belongs in the cluster API if we could compel hosted offerings to actually honor something like that. So maybe it is something that is only important when the cluster is first created. But again, it's this question of, should I be guaranteed that I'm allowed to configure this as a customer?
If it's not in conformance,
so I'll just comment
if it's not in conformance, why do you think it would be uniformly on?
That's what I was going to say. That is exactly the purpose of conformance, is to provide a guaranteed set of functionality for end users so they can know their workloads work consistently across those environments. So I think that that's a great point. It really comes into play when we decide whether this goes into conformance, which backs all the way up to Jordan's point of should that be a consideration early on in whether it becomes additive built-in API or not, which I think we've discussed a little bit, but I don't know if there's any conclusion. Jordan next, and then Tim, please.
Lower my hand. There we go. I was gathering a few thoughts. So back to Tim St. Clair's comment about component configuration. I am in favor of describing configuration in structured ways. I think that has a lot of benefits. It lets the example of if this was to be surfaced and controllable via a custom resource, a natural way to describe that would be to have that custom resource include the config snippet that would be given to the API server. I think describing that in a structured way is a positive thing to do, and making it simple to have a consistent way to make it available via a REST API if desired. That seems to me to be a natural mapping if a cluster operator wanted to expose this as a REST API. To Steve's point, I don't think controlling the authentication stack is fundamental to using a Kubernetes API. I think being given a Kubernetes API service that you can create custom resources against and create pods and interrogate config maps and like those things make sense to me as being fundamental to the API, and that's why those are the things that we have in conformance. I can certainly see use cases for adding in a custom authentication stack, but I don't think that's fundamental to being able to use the API.
Yeah, I think it's maybe I use a bad word with use. I think of it as operator. In other words, it is true that a user who you've blessed to do things like create config maps, they'll be perfectly happy with a system like that, but your organization might not even allow you to roll it out to users like that if certain other authentication things can't be put in place.
So my hand's up next. So I'll start. I have two points. I was sitting in the chat and I'm mostly agreeing with what Joe was saying. I don't have a strong feeling whether a provider-specific API for twiddling knobs or a common policy for twiddling knobs, or a common API rather. But I do think it's important that providers be able to say which knobs they're okay with you twiddling or not. If we want to do dynamic configuration of things like flags, that's totally cool, but I think providers need to be able to say, like, I can't support it if you twiddle this flag. And to the question about rights, I think the default position for everything that's not otherwise specified is it's up to the provider to decide if you're allowed to twiddle it or not. The providers are offering you different benefits for using them. Some are support and SLAs, some are low cost, some are SREs, whatever the trade-offs you're getting from your provider. If you don't like the knobs that they're allowing you to twiddle, either vote with your wallet or lobby them to change it. And the exception case there should always be if we as a community decide it's really important for somebody to be able to configure something like authentication, and we add an extensible API for it, like webhooks and CRDs, then cool, that becomes part of conformance, and providers will have to. I think that's how you can lobby the providers. To the question at hand, I actually have no strong opinion. I don't see why it's a bad idea. I'm not an auth person. If we think this is a common enough thing, and frankly, I've heard it many times, then we should support it dynamically, and that becomes something that conformance should cover, in my opinion. I'm done, thanks.
Joe, I'm not sure if you were on next or if I'm on next.
I think it was you, Daniel.
Okay. I just wanted to say something, like I'm slowly putting back into cache all this stuff we went through for other extensibility features, like webhooks and CRDs. And we felt it was pretty important at the time to get those conformance tested and basically mandate them everywhere, under the theory that an extensibility feature isn't really useful unless you can use it anywhere, right? Like the idea is like the whole promise of Kubernetes is workload portability, right? But as your workload starts to include parts and aspects of the control plane, you need to take those with you too, right? Your application isn't really portable if it depends on a CRD and you can't take that CRD somewhere else with you. So if the argument is that this is an extensibility feature for users, and users will rely on being able to take their identity system around with them like this, then it really ought to be conformance tested, right, and mandated. But if it's not that sort of extensibility feature, then maybe it doesn't need to be dynamic either. That's how I think about it. Anyway, that's all.
So, I mean, just to some of the stuff I was saying in the chat, I think, having the capability versus having the, allowing that as two separate things. Having a standard API for how you do that makes it easier for end users and consumers to say, I want you to enable X, right? Versus saying, I want you to enable me to do this flag, doing it, and then you have to plumb it through sort of like some other type of system to be able to do that. So I think it really creates a clear way for consumers to ask for that capability. Now, with respect to conformance, I've said for a long time, but I haven't put the work in to try and make it happen. So take that for what it is. We should have probably different buckets of conformance with logos and levels to go with it. And so then, like, I want, like, cluster control level 3 means, okay, you get to control this particular. I think there's stuff that can be done there. I don't think that conformance necessarily needs to be an all or nothing type of thing. In terms of like allowing this, and actually like one of the scenarios that I'm looking at here is that you look at something like OpenShift and it has a built-in OAuth server that's integrated into it. That allows you to do something like deploy a dashboard that allows end users to be able to log into the dashboard and then further authenticate to the API server in a unified way. That's a huge benefit to end users. And right now that's tied to the capabilities that are delivered from the underlying provider. Providing the mechanisms for people to start exploring what it means to be able to play with different auth systems and the way that they can integrate this in automated ways, whether that be a dashboard or whether it be other tools that are actually automating across multiple clusters coming from different vendors. That's a huge value plus to end users to be able to actually have a consistent tool story, including authorization, that they're using across all of their clusters. And for me, that's the real end user benefit that we're driving here.
Jordan, Mo, and then I thought Clayton has his hand up last.
Okay. So there are some aspects of what is proposed that I like the ability to address multiple OIDC providers. That's something that has been asked for a while in different contexts. I think starting slow and adding support, extending the current support for a single OIDC provider that's configured when the Kube API server starts, extending that to support multiple would give people who are configuring a Kube API server tools that would let them support this. It wouldn't require it. It wouldn't add a built-in API. It wouldn't raise the questions about conformance and all of that, but it would add tools to allow this, and then allowing providers to expose that via a CRD or via cluster API or via different mechanisms, checkbox in their web console that lets people spin up a cluster, however they want to expose it. That to me is the next step. That says, like, are people demanding this? If there's demand, then there's a clear way in the API server to provide it. I would rather see us start there instead of starting at this is a new built-in API. To me, this API does not seem like something the Cube API server should be serving. It seems like cluster API or cluster configuration. So yeah, to Tim's question, which Tim? David is not in favor of it. I am not in favor of it. Mike, Denise is not in favor of it.
Yeah, actually, if I can make a comment about that in particular, I mean, I think that SIG architecture isn't really an escalation point for overriding TLs of SIGs when they've made a decision. I mean, what we can talk about here are the kind of meta points that come up around, like, architecturally, do we want principles around this and around how we decide whether something's available as a runtime API versus a flags or a file. And I think we can have that discussion here, but the TLs of that SIG really are ultimately the ones who make the decision in this particular case. And I don't know that it's appropriate necessarily for SIG architecture to somehow override them or even has the authority to do so. So that's, for me, that's the context of this conversation. I'll say that is that this is about the architectural principles as opposed to this specific case. And following on that, I believe we did have hands. Is Clayton next, or was somebody else?
I just, before we move on, I did want to say, like, when I was reviewing the CAP, I was trying very hard to understand, like, specific requests and specific gaps in the current extension mechanisms the API server supports. And right now, supporting only a single OIDC provider seems to me like a gap that we could fix without radically altering the exposure of the current configuration. That would allow addressing the biggest requests that I've seen and were linked from the CAP. So my goal is not to just say, nope, everything's perfect, we're not going to touch anything. It's to identify what can we change, what can we add, what can we fix to unblock specific high value use cases.
Am I next? Okay, I'm not sure.
I believe Clayton is next, but I'm not. Oh no, Mo. I see Joe, then Jordan, then Mo. Yes, Mo, and then Clayton, I guess.
So on the whole, like, having multiple OIDC providers, right? Like, the part that's concerning there is, right, like, we'll do work in tree, which is fine. We always have to do stuff in there, right? But then we'll have to do work out of tree, and that's also fine. Maybe one-time kind of work, right? But the part that's a really hard sell is we're going to then ask every single provider to go wire this stuff up, right? And, like, wiring stuff to the API server is, like, the most painful thing in the world, right? What I'm trying to rationalize is, if you just left it off by default and then let a provider pass a flag to actually turn it on if they care, like, what is the harm? Right? Like, it gives you all, and, like,
to me, that's not the bar. The bar is not that it's harder to extend than to build in. As a consumer, built-in is always easier. That's how we ended up with 6 cloud provider libraries built in.
So this is not about the consumer, right? If at the end of the day, if the consumer gets a REST API, I think they'll be happy, right? Or sorry, a Cube REST API, probably, right? It's a vaguely consistent Cube REST API across providers is probably what a consumer would be happy with, right? I think the hard sell is going to be is you're going to ask every single provider to go do work, right? And I don't think that the top request is I want to have multiple OIDC providers. The top request is I just want to configure one dynamically on like EKS, right? Like that's actually the top request.
So I think we're actually kind of low on time here, and we're starting to drill into really a discussion that is between the SIG auth and maybe API machinery SIGs, as opposed to a policy discussion around like what are the principles behind our extensible functions. So I hear you that you're concerned that it creates additional work, but given the interest of time and several other people that want to talk, I think that discussion probably needs to be revisited in SIG auth or API machinery perhaps. I don't know exactly where we're continued on the mailing list, but let's let the next. I think it was Clayton was next.
Yeah, I wanted to drill on the meta point that Jordan brought up, which is, and to Joe's as well, like if the only way that you could accomplish something that is fairly reasonable, and by fairly reasonable, we obviously need a bar for what that is to put code into Kube API server, we're probably not done in terms of adding mechanisms. But I would probably say that feels like the first place that we would start a mechanism is allowing using a lower level primitive to accomplish that in the short run. So like in this example, like it should be possible to do server integrations that let you do OAuth integration cleanly or OIDC integration cleanly. But if you can use a lower level primitive, I think that's where we should start. And the bar, like when we think about what we define as a bar, like we should figure out a way to capture this into the bar is not that it could be useful or that it is useful or that some people might want it, but the bar is probably, it is so overwhelmingly obvious to a significant chunk, and I'm using vague words here because I don't know what that is, of the community that is obviously something we should take on. And over time in like this project, we've dropped that bar. Like that bar has gotten higher and higher. Like you have to do a lot to move the needle. And we still have a lot of other things that we're trying to work. But if you can't do it at all, I think that's the easiest one for, like as Jordan was saying in the specific case, if you can't do it at all, we should unblock it. But we don't have to unblock it by adding new surface area or extensive surface area for it.
So if I could rephrase, Clayton, what you're saying is essentially that if the function can be achieved in other ways with existing primitives, front proxy or other things we do, then adding it to the surface area, even if that's more painful.
So just
a starting
really concrete example. We have emission webhooks. They don't solve every problem. There's things that people do to fork the API server to accomplish that, running custom code. There's a bar where you cross the line from running custom code in a Kube API server to something like an emission webhook. There's a middle ground, which is the lower level primitive. We should make sure we have those as necessary to accomplish these. But I think the bar between that and the next higher level is growing over time in this project. It should be possible, it's just we don't have to make it easy.
Clayton, as a related point, did you want to discuss what you had brought up, I think maybe 2 SIG auths ago, maybe even before that, that we never addressed the surface area of Kube that crosses the boundary between workloads and infrastructure?
Oh yeah, that's like 30 minutes discussion. We probably run it out, but it was just a very brief, like that when we were trying to come up with a framing for this, one of them was, we started by being very workload specific and we left the door open that we could be a meta provider and you can install all of these APIs, and Brendan forced us to put a bunch of code in and we all hated him and then we did it and it turned out to be good. But like extending the API service, adding aggregate APIs, adding webhooks, we did that to specifically grow the ecosystem for the end app. But there are a lot of people who found value in the meta of the loopback for managing the platform itself, or injecting things that make the platform more powerful for all the components. We never really defined what the difference between how much time we spend on managing the platform, except as config or as basic primitives, and how much we have workloads. We have a gap between them, and we've never unified them.
So one thing I'm still struggling. Go ahead.
You're next, Joe. I was just going to say you're next.
I mean, one thing I'm still struggling with is, you know, we have a fairly extensive set of APIs around essentially managing and improving certificates, the CSR stuff. And practically there's no reason for that stuff to be built in. And with an extension point that we're talking about here, you could actually layer that on top of this. And so in my mind, a good test of extension capabilities is if you can actually find more universal truths that are lower level than the stuff that you had to hack in there. I've always been very, very uncomfortable with the CSR stuff. And so talking about the kubelets, actually, you know, I see Daniel's down there talking about the kubelets using the CSR stuff. There's no reason why that couldn't have been built on the outside and actually built into some of the cluster API kubeadmin stuff. In fact, we actually did some stuff as part of that for kubeadmin that was some of the proto work for the CSRs. There's absolutely no reason that has to be built in. And so I think this is, you know, a similar thing where, you know, we could take the CSR stuff, actually layer it on with extension mechanisms using the multi-provider type of point of view to be able to do it. And I think, that sort of universal truth in discovering those sort of lower level systems for me is a good litmus test of the types of things that we should be driving towards.
Just to Joe's point, a couple notes there. When kubelet bootstrapping and CSRs were added, custom resources did not exist, kubeadmin did not exist, cluster API did not exist. So if those things did exist,
kubeadmin did exist.
1.3, really?
The bootstrap tokens actually predated any of the automatic CSR stuff that we added for kubeadmin.
Interesting. And exec-based client authentication did not exist. So the ability to give a kubelet a kube config and it say, like, I'm going to make an API call, go get a cred, and like be able to get it via whatever mechanism you wanted. All but one of those things did not exist. If they had, it is likely that the CSR and kubelet bootstrapping stuff would look different and would have been built on top or as an extension.
Yeah, but we've been continuing to sort of add more features and expand the footprint of the CSR stuff beyond just service accounts and just kubelets.
I wouldn't say we're expanding it. I would say we are actually like documenting and clarifying what it currently is and what promises and guarantees it has. So again, my perspective on the dynamic auth stuff is that we should unblock gaps that exist. In my mind, that is the multi-OIDC support. We should go slow and not add built-in APIs to address this. And then we should see how people use the multi-OIDC capability, whether they surface it via cluster API or via custom mechanisms, and reevaluate whether this is widely used enough and there's demand and the controls that can be placed around it are sufficient to build it into the Kube API server. I'm not in favor of that, but if further evidence and the rest of the project decides this is a direction, I'd be willing to hear that, but I wouldn't start there.
James, I think, has his hand up, and we're pretty much out of time. So if we can hear from him, and then
I just wanted to know what we need to do next. Hippie is willing to write some of this up, but I think we need to work on some decision tree that Jordan mentioned right at the beginning.
Just to be clear, that decision tree is really hard, as I mentioned earlier, given the history and where we're at. So it's going to be a little bit of a what would we like versus what have we done in the past and where we are.
Yeah, where do we want to end up? Yeah.
Yeah, obviously we can only affect the future, not the past. So let's look at the decision tree for what we think is the right principles moving forward, and that's the best we can do. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Obviously, no time for the other things on the agenda. I think that Hippie has volunteered to write this up, the notes, and try to summarize and send it out to the mailing list. So please look forward to that and reply and clarify whether it's accurate or not. If probably easiest, Hippie, if you put that in a Google Doc and then people can comment on it, as opposed to having a mailing thread. If that's acceptable to everybody. Thank you very much, everybody. Interesting discussion, and we will talk to you all soon.
Hey, you guys. Bye.
Bye.